Welcome to Firsts in Fiction, your first stop for learning to write fantastic fiction. I'm your host, Aaron Gansky, author of The Bargain, The Hand of Adonai series, Who is Harrison Sawyer, and Firsts in Fiction.
And I'm Alton Gansky, the author of about 50 works, including being one of the writers in the Harbinger series and also recently re-released Finder's Fee and several other books. So they're all there on the website.
All of them, all the minis books are on the website.
And speaking of websites, I'm also a typewriter addict, and I've posted today another one of my typewriters, a little view of it, and it's kind of close to my heart because it's the kind of typewriter I had it was my first typewriter, and called an Eldorado, kind of spiffy looking, little sleek thing. So you can either jump over to YouTube, YouTube/Alton Gansky, or you can just go to the website and see it there on the blog site page. So whatever, it's there.
And I'm sure you'll add those to the show notes as when I'm doing my Ask the Author portion, I would imagine, so that people can see that. I noticed you uploaded something because it came through on my phone. It said Alton Gansky has uploaded a video. So
Typewriter Tuesday.
Typewriter Tuesday. It's pretty exciting. So I do want to remind those of you who are listening to the audio only, you can watch us live Tuesdays at 6:30 p.m. Pacific Standard Time. Of course, you can watch us anytime at aarongansky.com or on YouTube. You can reach us at firstsinfictionpodcast@gmail.com to send us all sorts of Ask the Author questions, or you can do that via aarongansky.com. Many of you are probably wondering where Molly is again. And I think I mentioned last week that she is unable to join us through the month of December. She's had to take the month off for a variety of reasons, but she's taken the month off. She should be back in January. So if you're looking for Miss Molly, she is sadly not here. You're going to have to deal with just Pops and I, which is always a challenge. I don't even know if we like putting up with ourselves, much less
it's a Gansky overdose.
Yeah, it's too much. It's the double Gansky. So it's like a double rainbow, but it's a double Gansky. You've seen that double rainbow video, Pops, I'm assuming?
No, I have no idea what you're talking about.
It's funny. It's weird, but it's ridiculous. Anyhow, moving on.
It's where somebody sees a double rainbow?
They see the double rainbow and they freak out. Oh, it's a double rainbow.
Yeah. Well, you can see up to 3. The physics
is that the limit?
In the right conditions, you can it'll refract up to 3 times before it becomes impossible to see. But yeah. Now,
speaking of physics, I have been listening to Star Talk Radio of late. So thought I'd throw that out there, Pops. You and I can talk about that later. It's a good podcast. So you can find us on YouTube. If you are watching on YouTube, we ask that you would hit that little thumbs up button. Helps us out quite a bit. Also, if you have not already done so, please subscribe. That also helps us out quite a bit. So if you're watching us live on aarongansky.com/firstsinfictionlive, you will notice that there's a chat room there where you can ask us questions. We'll be monitoring that throughout the night as the opportunity presents itself. And you'll notice some links there above the chat window that you can share with your followers via Twitter and Facebook and all that wonderful social media stuff. So if you could do that for us, that would also help us out there. I think we're done with the intro. That's it's a lot of words. It is a lot of words. So let's move on to Ask the Author. I'm going to mess up this first name, and I apologize, but this is from Iani Peterson. Is it Ianie? Iani, is that how you would say it, Pops?
I think so. Mostly because I just don't want to contradict you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. So I'm sure she'll contradict us when she hears this, but she asks, what's the best way to promote your book? Is it press releases, book signings, a party, a book signing, and a potluck dinner? And my answer was yes. I don't know, Pops, do you have anything else to add? Now, I will say that everything that she mentioned is fantastic. I do want to be completely honest and completely transparent here, though. I don't do much in the way of book releases. I'm a busy guy. And quite honestly, I'm just going to be, since I'm going to be honest and transparent anyway, I'm not much of a people person, especially in large crowds. I get really uncomfortable. I just did a book signing, and it was it turned out well, but it's very emotionally taxing for me. I don't know. I don't like a lot of people. Meeting new people sometimes is uncomfortable for me. Not because I don't like the people, but just because I don't know. It's a personality thing. I'm very much an introvert, and so doing like parties for my books releases just is not something that comes to my mind naturally at all. That being said, it doesn't mean it's bad at all. I think. Especially if you got some family and friends, and this is a first book, I think a potluck is a fantastic idea, or some sort of just small gathering of friends, family, supporters. That would be awesome. Um, I've done Facebook launch parties, so kind of the digital version of that. The advantage to that is you can sit there in your pajamas and do it, and nobody has to know. But there you do, you give away some behind the scenes information. You thank your readers. Maybe do some giveaways or something like that to keep everybody kind of engaged. The advantage to that, of course, is that nobody has to travel. They can do it from the comfort of their own home. You can, if you're just on the East Coast, you can have West Coast people attend. It's that kind of stuff. So people can do it while they're in their jammies cooking dinner, whatever the case may be. But those digital kinds of releases can sometimes be beneficial, a little easier to promote. My last book signing, I had several readers, send me messages, said, I'd love to go to your book signing. Can you, shoot me a plane ticket real quick? You just, email that over and I'll be right there. So that obviously is not necessarily ideal. The book signings that I've done, I try and do fairly close to the release. This last time I had 2 books released, one in August, one in November, I believe. And I waited until December to do the book signing because I wanted to try and get some holiday traffic. You could also do interviews with your local newspaper if you've got a small local newspaper, press releases. I've done a TV spot on a local talk show. Sadly, now it's defunct. I don't know if I got many readers from that, but that was kind of a fun little thing. I know you can sometimes do readings. Take your book down to a Barnes & Noble, get the manager's permission, and sometimes you just bring a little microphone and amp and you just read some of your book there, and that can sometimes get people interested. Talking to local libraries, bookstores, they might let you do some readings. And if you are not afraid of crowds, that's a great thing to do. Christopher Paolini of the Aragon series fame, he did that. He used to read at libraries and at schools. And he was originally self-published. And then in the course of his readings, one of the kids heard it, told his dad. His dad just happened to be the publisher of like Random House or whatever it is. Ended up getting a pretty decent contract from that. So readings can sometimes be beneficial as well. Schools, high schools, those types of things where you can get in and just talk for an hour or so about what it is to be a writer and an author, and you can kind of sometimes generate some interest there. So really, it's not one thing, it's a plethora of things, and it's really kind of a grab bag of what you are comfortable doing, what you feel that you would be good at, and what you can do well. And so that's kind of your triangle there that you want to think of. What am I comfortable doing? What can I do well? And whatever else I mentioned, I guess the proper timing. Those are the things to consider when you're thinking about supporting a book release. How about you, Pops?
Yeah, this is always a tough question, and the things you suggested, Aaron, are excuse me, are solid. The difficult truth is this: there is no proven marketing technique to make a book a bestseller. If it was, and all the publishers would have nothing but bestsellers in their catalog. We don't know what kicks them off. It's not even great writing. We know that it can play a role in it, but there are those that have had some really badly written books hit the New York Times bestseller list and stay up there for 6 months or so.
Twilight.
Yeah.
Twilight.
No.
We don't want to name names here. We don't want to name names.
Trolling for a lawsuit here.
I know.
But there's just no proven way. We know that that authors need to get out there. That's one of the changes that's happened in publishing. They really expect the author to be the chief marketer, unless you're very lucky to get into a proper traditional publisher that will take the responsibility and assign their marketing team to you. But another thing that most people don't realize, especially new writers, is the people who get the marketing dollars, the authors who get the marketing dollars, are already bestsellers. Most of the marketing dollars go into promoting bestsellers, not new people. So some way or another, your book has to become a bestseller. Then they get very interested in promoting stuff. So I know that's not what people want to hear. It's just the way it is. So what can you do? I think really your best bet is to create a social media presence, because you can just, I've got several thousand people on my Facebook, so I can sometimes just send something out and, a little posting or something and get a response, but that didn't happen overnight. So social media is probably the way to go. I've also had some luck with radio interviews, but with fiction, they usually don't want to do radio interviews, the host, because there's just so many novels that come out. So I began turning the tables on that by picking one subject that I could talk about as if it were a nonfiction book, like self-deception. I did a book called Angel. I think I've shared this before, but nonetheless, I did a book called Angel, and in it I make the comment that one of the greatest dangers we face is self-deception, not deception from others, but self-deception. And that generated a lot of interest. So I'd go on and I would talk about that, and of course, you always end up talking about your book. So it's sort of a backwards way of doing things, but that can work. And then I would notice on some of these things, nonfiction, for example, gets more radio interviews, but I could see a little uptick in sales, at least through Amazon. It's the only one you can monitor on a daily basis from doing those things. So bottom line, there is no proven way. You do what you can. There's some very famous authors who used to sell books out of the back of their car until they hit it. So there's no easy answer.
Yeah, I used to sell books out of the back of my car. I'd just scratch off all the serial numbers, sell them out of the back of my trunk, usually at night in dark alleys. I thought that might drum up the market, but just didn't work for me. So this isn't working, is it? This joke, it's not working. All right.
Move on here. Let's move on here.
Moving on. All right. Well, our topic tonight is killing your darlings, and it's one that we've mentioned before, haven't spent a ton of time. We thought we'd take a look at it tonight. Pops, what are we talking about when we say kill your darlings?
Well, it's a phrase that's used in publishing quite a bit, and most people attribute it to Faulkner. We don't know if he got it from someone else. Some have gone back and said it was Mark Twain that did that. I don't know. I know that Stephen King, in his book on writing, his writing memoir, wrote, kill your darlings, even when it breaks your egocentric little scribbler's heart, kill your darlings. So apparently he had a strong opinion about that. So when we talk about a darling, and I'm going to let you be the professor tonight, Aaron. When we talk about a darling, what do we mean?
Darling is really anything, but it's something. It's a bit of writing that you love, and I want to make sure that our listeners know that there's nothing inherently wrong with darlings. Just because you love something that you've written doesn't mean you immediately need to take it out. I've had people say that, oh, well, I love this, so therefore I have to take it out. That's not the spirit of what kill your darlings means. Ideally, everything you put on the page is going to be a darling. Of course, in the course of a 95,000 word book, that's not going to be the case. And there are several darlings that will make it to final drafts of the novels, but there are several that don't. The issue is when the darlings don't, as we say in the business, they don't earn their place.
Yeah, right.
Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does make sense. And if you write for very long, this is going to happen. You're going to write something you really love and you realize it doesn't fit. And I know it's happened to me. I write something, I thought that's maybe some of the best stuff I've ever written, and then 5, 6, 7 chapters later, I'm starting to think, that really does not fit anymore, and have to take it out. And that can be kind of painful. We'll talk about what to do with those, I imagine, as we move on. So as you say, then the important thing is make sure your darling earns its place, that it belongs there. So you have some guidelines. Is there several things we should be thinking about when we think about killing these little darlings?
Yeah, I think the first test is going to be, it's kind of a binary question. Here's a darling. Do I keep it? Does it have to go? And the answer to that really rests solely on, is it earning its place? And again, earning its place means, does it further the story in some way? And the question is, how is it furthering the story? How does it move your story along? And there's a couple things that you can look for. The first thing that you want to look for is if the passage is introducing tension or conflict. Okay, so if this is a darling that you love and it introduces tension or conflict, you're probably okay. The primary element of fiction is conflict. And tension is very much the same thing. It's the feeling that something horrible might happen. Conflict is when something horrible happens. Tension is when the reader feels as if something terrible might happen. It's a subtle difference, but it's an important distinction. So even if you have something that adds to the suspense but doesn't necessarily add to the conflict, it might still earn its place. The problem is when we don't have tension or conflict, we don't have a scene at all. Or the scene drags. That's to say that we're boring our reader. Each scene should contribute in some way to the primary tension or conflict. If not, then it's not furthering our story, and it's got to be done away with. This is why long passages of flowery description generally only work when bookended by tension, and this is something that Flannery O'Connor, Charles Baxter talks about in his essays that he collected on writing called Burning Down the House, and he talked about stillness, and it's this idea of heightened tension here, and then you've got a passage of stillness, which is kind of the flowery description, kind of the poetic voice that we talked about a few weeks ago, and then more tension on the other side, or conflict on the other side. That bookending is going to, then what you're doing is you're stretching out time. And that's okay, because what you're doing is by stretching out time, you're also stretching out tension, even though there may not be tension inherent in that particular section. But if there's no conflict before or after, and we've just got these long flowery descriptions and there's no tension, now we're just slowing our scene down. So you want to avoid that. If you're going to be using long descriptions, you want to make sure that it's for a purpose and that it's placed very specifically, structured very specifically to kind of keep things going. That's one of the first things that I look for.
Yeah, and I want to add here that the reason these long flowery, they don't have to be flowery, they can be anything, it just doesn't really apply, doesn't move the story forward, is that writers used to get paid by the word. So Earl Stanley Gardner, Perry Mason, he did about 80 Perry Masons and a bunch of other books and the like. And he would be asked occasionally why, if there's a gunfight, does the hero only achieve success after he fires his last bullet? And he said, because I get 3 cents a word, and every time I write the word bam, I get 3 cents. So I'm not going to let my character off the hook when he's still got 15 cents in there for me. So you see the motivation there was to make a few more bucks. And that's the way many of the older books were. Well, that's not the case anymore. More and more people have come to understand that tight writing is the best writing with that. And let me throw in something here. Sometimes we use the term suspense instead of just tension and conflict. Again, when we talk about tension and conflict, it doesn't have to be a gunfight. I was just thinking about I think the book's Farewell, My Lady, about a boy who finds a dog and is going to have to give the dog up. And that's the tension, is what's going to happen to the boy, what's going to happen to the dog. And that's what the whole story is. And it's a literary piece with it. But there is tension, there is conflict, and there's a sense of suspense that something bad is about to happen. Now, while we're talking about suspense, one of my favorite stories is Alfred Hitchcock was describing suspense. And he said, if I'm making a movie and I show a restaurant and 2 people go in and then the restaurant blows up, well, that's not suspense. That's maybe action, but it's not suspense. Suspense is showing somebody plant the bomb under one of the tables in the restaurant, and these 2 people sit down next to it. And then they start a conversation. That's suspense, because the viewer knows something's going to happen. They just don't know when. So that's, I think, one of the ideas in all of this is if your darling is doing some meaningful work, it's creating suspense or tension or conflict, then that's probably a keeper. Okay, so we got this one thing here, this introduce tension or conflict. You got another item for us, don't you?
Yeah. Another question to ask is your darling introducing or developing characters? If so, then it can stay. In a longer work, characters are going to need to be developed, usually through tension and conflict, and this still needs to be present while you're establishing your characters. But the level of conflict and tension can wane a little bit as long as you're developing characters, where we get to know them. And this is going to be an important character throughout the course of the novel. I would advise you that if you're simply developing a character that's not going to be actively involved in the story, that maybe it's a darling that needs to go. You might need to get rid of the entire character, but if it's a major player in the story, and you have them, I don't want to say walking a dog, but something to show the relationship between the protagonist and his or her animal, showing kind of their sacrificial nature. Okay, that's going to give us something about your character that we may not have otherwise gotten. So if you are developing your character, then it is a darling that can stay, that it is earning its place.
Right. Character, of course, is extremely important. I think that's what you're telling us here. You really don't have story if you don't have character. It's great, and it's true to say you don't really have story unless you have some kind of crisis, some kind of tension, some kind of conflict. But you don't have one if you don't have character. And even if the characters are animals, I'm thinking of Jonathan Livingston Seagulls, where they're seagulls, but they're anthropomorphisms. That's really people that we're dealing with there. So we have to have characters, and you can create a ton of tension and further the story, pick up the pace and all of that by how you show your characters. And I don't mean just the protagonist. We sometimes fixate on the protagonist so much that we overlook the antagonist. The antagonist sometimes is more important than the protagonist. So I had a supporting antagonist once that I showed, and I wanted to show that he was just a bad guy. And what I really wanted to show was, how do I put this, that his elevator didn't go all the way to the top. He was not in his right mind. And he's in a expensive hotel, and he's on the 20th floor, and he gets some bad news, and he goes ballistic, and he tears up the room, and then he strips down into his all together and climbs out onto the balcony and sits on the rail of the balcony, stark, raving naked, looking down 200 feet to the ground below. And so who does this? Well, what the reader's going to do in this, and understanding that wild-eyed character, is they know my timid protagonist is going to have to deal with this guy. And that creates a tension that lasts throughout the book. They know at some point or another, they're going to be in a locker room together, or something's going to happen to them. And they start worrying about the protagonist. So the way you develop your characters is very important. And that is a darling you want to keep. If you're developing your characters just because you want to, give them a little spit polish or just make them look good, or you like the character an awful lot, then that might be something you want to cut out. In fact, we'll summarize all this in a little bit, I think. Yeah. All right, so we have those two ideas. Introduce or develop a character be the second. What's the next one?
The third one is really the final element of fiction, which is resolving tension or conflict. And I often teach, and I think, Pop, you're going to say something very similar in a bit, but I'm going to steal your thunder early. The idea is the fundamental elements of fiction are character conflict and motivation. Your character has to want something, and there has to be something between your character and what it is that they want. So as long as you're developing that character, developing the obstacle, or developing the motivation of their desires, as long as you're doing one of those three, you're okay. Here, the third one is resolving the tension or conflict, where they overcome the obstacle, okay? Man wants a glass of water. He can't because there's a wall in the way. He grabs a sledgehammer, takes the wall down, and gets his glass of water. Hooray. You're not going to cut the scene where he gets his glass of water. He's been working for that. And so if your darling is resolving this tension or conflict, And it doesn't have to be the central conflict, especially in a 95,000 word novel. You're going to have several conflicts going on. And so you might be resolving a lesser conflict, a smaller plot line that's been weaving through your main plot line. You still need to resolve those. You still have to tie up those loose ends. So that's where, a darling is going to be earning its place, is if it's tying up those loose ends. So is it developing the character? Is it developing the tension? Is it resolving the tension or conflict? Those are the questions that you want to ask. If it's doing one of those three, then it's probably earning its place.
Yeah, I've taught these principles this way. If your scene, and it's usually when we're cutting our darlings, it's usually a scene. If your scene does not, number one, further the story, or two, define a major character, or three, set up an action yet to come, then get rid of it. Al's axiom number 55, fluff is great for pillows, but deadly to fiction. Yeah. Fluff is great for pillows, but it's deadly for fiction. And that's really what it comes down to, is we love our work, we want to be loved because of our work, but sometimes it's not the best thing for the story.
And that can be problematic. How do we recognize this? Some of the sneaky prose killers, in terms of darlings, that I think are most prevalent, and I don't have this in the show notes, I'm just doing this off the top of my head here, Pops, and maybe you can help me brainstorm some ideas here, but I would think that one of the most prominent darlings that needs to go is a scene that develops a characteristic of one of your characters that has already been well established. So you're kind of beating a dead horse at this point. Another one might be, a long flowery description of a character that's really not necessary, kind of a secondary, tertiary character that has no, overall play in the story, that might need to go. A particular character that's not doing anything else except showing up to occasionally crack a joke. If they're not doing something else, they may not be earning their plays. Those are a few that I can think of off the top of my head of these killers, these darlings that show up and do not earn their place. Do you find in your writing, Pops, that you have certain categories of darlings that you end up having to kill?
I don't know that I have categories. Sometimes it takes me a while to recognize that what I've written just isn't going to fit anymore, or I've gone over the top. Give you an example. I did a book a long time ago where I have two people, and they're going to become a couple in this, but they're both damaged one way or another in all of this. And the woman in it has a physical deformity that's kept one leg a little shorter than the other, so she has a built-up shoe, and she's walking with a built-up shoe, and this has a psychological effect on her. That's fine. That's all well and good. But I kept mentioning the limp. And I had my secretary read it back in the days when I had a secretary. And she was reading it. She told me how much she enjoyed it. But she got to the point in the manuscript where she said, enough with the limp already. And that's when I realized, okay, I'm beating this dead horse here. And I began to understand the reader will remember that. I don't need to tell them every time she's in a scene. So that was a darling I had to get rid of. Of course, once she put it that way, it was no longer a darling. It would just look like a mistake to me. But at the time, I thought I was doing quality work with that. So,
the exception to that, and it's rarely done anymore, but back in the olden days, you would have, anaphoras. So you'd have repeated descriptions like the rosy-fingered dawn, where you'd use that particular description to describe an aspect of a character. And you would use it every single time you talked about that character, and it became almost poetic, a poetic repetition of it. I think at some point, modern editors are a little more, I don't want to say short-tempered, but they tend to not smile on those as favorably, and perhaps they miss the poetic quality, or perhaps it's just not ringing true with them. But I think most readers are in the enough with the lip category. And I've read several books where I'm like, yeah, no, I get it. They've got a limp, or whatever it might be. Some sort of one of the ones that I struggle with is a characteristic. One character in particular is Detective Parker in the Hand of Adonai series, I gave him a great little characteristic where he's got a cigarette behind his ear,
Mm-hmm.
and he takes it out and he puts it in his mouth. And this woman tells him, I'd prefer if you don't smoke. And he goes, I'm not smoking. And he never lights the thing. He just keeps putting it in his mouth and then put it back behind his ear. And so it becomes a bit of a joke. But one thing that happens is when he's on the scene, I have to remember he's got that cigarette. And then I also have to remember not to make it too big a point in the story. And so I'll bring it up at important moments to kind of describe his inner state of mind. But I do have to be cautious because there are times where it just gets to be too much, and it's no longer cute or funny. Now it's just kind of annoying. So yeah, that's a good point to make, is the repetition of particular characteristics.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely.
So it doesn't have to be an entire chapter. It can be just a single description that we fall in love with, but no one else is going to fall in love with. Dave has asked an interesting question. He said, "Can your darlings be as much as a whole chapter?"
So the example that's coming to my mind right now is the Grapes of Wrath, in which I believe it's chapter 2. Chapter 1 is just description of Dust Bowl, just Dust Bowl. Everything sucks. Chapter 2 is about a turtle crossing a road, and it's getting closer and closer, and it just, it's going to be across the road soon, and everything's going to be fine once it's across the road. And then a truck comes and runs the turtle over, and it dies. That's chapter 2. Chapter 3 is finally we get to our protagonist, and I'm thinking, that is the most depressing thing I've ever read in my life. It's just like pages and pages of this turtle crossing a road, and then you just smash it at the man, John Steinbeck. Like, if you're going to read that book, make sure you got a box of Kleenex and a bottle of Prozac. Make sure there's nothing sharp laying around when you read that book. But it starts off depressing and it gets worse. But is that a darling? Well, it's beautifully written. Does it earn its place? It's going to depend on which reader you ask. It definitely sets the tone, and that's something else that we didn't really talk about. In our 3 is the tension, the conflict, and the character, or the resolution. If it's setting a tone, then you can say it's earning its place. If the tone has already been set and you're still setting the same tone, then maybe it needs to go. But in this particular case, I'd say it would earn its place. Now, have I read other novels that have had entire chapters that felt like fluff? Absolutely. Can it be an entire chapter? I would say yes. It's not the norm, but different writers are prone to different things. So some writers, I'm sure, are tearing chapters out all the time. Ernest Hemingway in the Sun Also Rises famously tore out the first, I believe, 3 chapters, at least the first 2, if not the first 3, because Fitzgerald told him that they weren't working, and he had to fix them. So Hemingway just tore them out, and now that's his best opening, widely considered to be his best opening. So for him, those 2 chapters were perhaps what he would term darlings. So I would say, yeah, it's possible, but I would say it's probably not the norm.
Yeah. And maybe this is what Dave has in mind, because he furthers the question. He says, "I'm working on a novel about a medieval storyteller that I plan to include some chapters which consist of stories told by the storyteller. Could that be a darling?"
Man, yes, absolutely. And I think it's actually the probability of them being darlings is going to be much higher. And you'll want to really read with a critical eye. There have been several fantasy novels, and I know from my conversations with Dave earlier that this may not be quote unquote a fantasy novel because there's no necessarily supernatural elements involved, but more historical medieval novel as recollection serves. But in the bargain, I do something similar where I've got a character telling the stories of other people. I had to make sure that each of those tied into the larger story somehow. And that was a challenge because some of them did and some of them didn't. And if I would go back to that book now, I would probably say here's a chapter that needs to change dramatically, or perhaps even be cut. And I think I may have cut a few of the stories out because they didn't tie in well to the rest of the main plot line. Several fantasy novels use this kind of trope with storytellers retelling old stories. But I think what really resonates with readers is when there's a payoff at the end. So if I read something in chapter 4 that echoes in chapter 14, now chapter 4 was worth my time. If I read something in chapter 5 that never echoes in the rest of the book, then I have to question why chapter 5 is there. That's probably qualifies as a darling. I'm not sure if that clarified it or not, but that's kind of how I would respond to that. Pops, would you say something different?
No, I think you're on, but I would put it this way. Remember the criteria that we were talking about. Does it further the story? Does it define the character? Does it set up action to come? So if Dave is thinking, I'm gonna do a spin-off of Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, where I have somebody telling stories, so you have stories within stories, then I would say, yeah, that's probably not going to work. But if the stories he's telling somehow either furthers the story or reveals more about the character, then I would say it might not be a darling. It depends if it's going to achieve something by doing that, rather than just saying, we're going to typeset this differently to look really cool in a book. That's always a little dicey. It might happen that way, but it could go south pretty quick. So that's what I would say is, if the stories that Dave's talking about, that is the storyteller, medieval storyteller, telling some of his stories, and each of those is a different chapter, if it ties together something and either explains something about the character or furthers the scene, or sets up something to come, some bit of action, then I'd say you're good. If not, then I would be careful with it.
Well said. Yeah, I in the bargain, and I think that's the closest analog, and that's why it's coming to my mind most often here. I have a character, a one-legged waitress, and I did not intend for her to be in the story, but she kind of hobbled onto the scene. I don't know what it is with us Pops writing about women with limps, but she kind of limped onto the scene. And originally I just did it as kind of a quick joke, kind of a one-liner I wanted to work in there. But it became a thing, and the characters kept talking about it. And then I realized, well, of course, here I am writing a novel about a man telling stories of people in this town. He's got to tell her story. And I didn't know what her story was at the beginning. And once I found out, she became integral to the plot. One of my favorite characters that I've written was her. And so that was a darling that I kind of repurposed and made work, if that makes sense. Does that make sense?
It does. And I think you're bringing up a great point here. You don't necessarily have to cut your darlings, kill the darlings. Sometimes they just have to be dressed a little differently. Go back and say, now, all right, this isn't working. Is there some way I can make this work? Can I make this scene or this description or this character important? And don't do it just because you like the character. Do it because it's going to play some role in the story. It's always the story. Two things you never forget: the story and the reader. So if you can do that, then it's not a problem. You just have to rewrite that. And of course, we all know that writing isn't writing until it's rewritten. So, well, let me ask you this. So we decide we're going to kill some of our darlings. What do we do once they're dead?
I would bury the bodies and make sure nobody tails you. Destroy all the evidence. Make sure you're wearing gloves. This is not what you were looking for. It's kind of the cheap joke, the low-hanging fruit. All right, moving on. There's lots of things that you can do. The first that I do is I save it for a different story. If I come to the conclusion that this is just not earning its place in this novel, it might fit into another novel, especially if you're writing a series. Maybe it's just a little bit early. Work out better later on. If, however, you're writing a standalone and this just isn't working in this book, maybe the scene works better in a different book with different characters. But you can hang on to it. There's nothing that says that you have to throw it away.
I had to do something like this. I had sold a book, but it was too long for what the publisher wanted. And I had to take like 1 out of every 5 pages out. That was the equivalent to the cutting. I had written kind of a long book. And it was tough to do. The only other thing I've done that is as bad or maybe worse is converting a novel into a screenplay. uh, which is really, really tough to do because you have to combine characters and stuff, and you only have 120 script pages. They're not even prose pages. They're script formatted pages. So it's very, very small. But I had to cut a lot of scenes. That's one of the first things I did. There are character scenes, there's secondary plots I can cut. And I had to take out several of my very favorite scenes that I worked really hard on. And I just saved them. And a number of years later, I was working on a book, and that scene came to mind, and I was able to use it. And I just plunked it down. It was a great productive day in the old page count. Because I had 15 pages, all I had to do was cut and paste. Then I had to do, a little changing of things so it would fit into the story better. But I was able to save a couple of those. Some of them, they're just gone. So save it for a different story.
Mm-hmm. You can also work it in somewhere else. The pacing of a story is very, very important. And that's one of the things that you can monitor. Where are your moments of high tension and where are your moments of low tension? Talked about Charles Baxter and stillness, about trying to bookend these still moments with conflict and tension on either side. Maybe you've just got too big of a lull. And if you've kind of lulled, the tension has, and things are kind of flat for a while, emotionally speaking, maybe what you do is you just swap two scenes. Maybe it's not murdering the darling, but maybe it's just relocating the darling. You're moving them out of the apartment building and into the penthouse, maybe, so that it's going to work better, so you can better control the flow, the ebb and the flow of the pacing of your story and the conflict and tension within your story. So you can work it in somewhere else. You can also, and I believe Dean Koontz did this, you can also turn it into its own work. Pops, I think you were telling me the story of Odd Thomas came as a character in a different book, and then he ended up taking him out and turning it into his own series.
No, not Odd Thomas. The opening line to Odd Thomas came to him while he was working on another book. So it wasn't that Odd Thomas appeared elsewhere, but he did do that. Oh, I'm sorry I brought this up now. I can't think of which book it is, but he had somebody appear in one novel, and then later he became the antagonist in another novel. So that can happen, certainly.
Especially if you're writing books that all take place in the same town or something like that, the same time period. It's very easy to kind of have crossover. You see that a lot, actually, like in comic books and the like. They're always developing a larger story world. And so perhaps it doesn't fit in this book, but maybe it's going to be its own. Maybe you really like this antagonist, but you've already got another really good antagonist, so you're just going to save this antagonist for the sequel, or you're going to change a few characteristics and turn it into the antagonist of your next book. I highly advocate repurposing your darlings. It's, I guess, a little more sensational to say kill them, but I think it might be a little more appropriate to say repurpose your darlings, either, as you say, Pops, to dress them up a little bit differently, relocate them, use them in a different story. Occasionally, you just have to let them go. I will save scenes and descriptions, just paragraphs of descriptions. I'll save those. And I've gone back and I've used them before. And I've actually done a book where the first draft, I basically started the second draft from scratch. And all I did was go back and read the first one and all I did was find darlings. Yep, like this. Yep, like this. Yep, like this. Brought them back. And that's all I kept were my darlings. Everything else got cut. And so there are different ways to kind of handle that. But I think the best thing is to think of saving them first, and then later on figure out how you can use them if you can. Occasionally, you're going to have a darling that just won't work in any situation, sadly. And then you write a blog post.
I had a character, I've done this a couple of times, where I have a character in one book that has a minor role, but I love the character so much that they get a bigger role in an entirely different book. So that happened in I just thought the mystery series in Ridgeline.
I know what you're talking about. Just a Small Dose of Murder.
Yeah, the Gates character.
Yeah.
With who's a medical doctor, where his sister is the mayor of this small town. Now later I do Perry Sachs series of books, and the first one, A Treasure Deep, her name's Anne, Anne appears again. This time she's still mayor, but she had moved out. Her husband had died, and so she just moved away, didn't want to live in the same town. And she plays a major role in the book. So before she was just sort of a foil for the main character. She's a supporting protagonist in a book that comes out several years later. And then my first character in By My Hands, Adam Bridger, makes an appearance in my book Wounds, which is many books later. He's not the chief protagonist, but he's a supporting protagonist in that role. Instead of having the lead, he's a support actor in that. So he and his wife appear in that. So some of those characters were my darlings, and you just can't keep making every character the same. In this case, I just shifted their locations and called them by the same name. Only avid readers of my works would notice that.
Well, let me toss this back to you on a couple of points, because you brought up a couple things, bringing characters into other books. You mentioned the term foil, so if you don't mind, let's just real quick, why don't you define what a foil is?
Depending how it's used, and I'm using it in very broad terms, but it's someone who is either an irritant to your protagonist, somebody who ridicules them, somebody who gets in the way, who maybe even causes some comic relief, that sort of thing. So in this case, this character I'm talking about, Anne, just irritates her sister over and over again. They're sisters. They're adult sisters, but they get on each other's nerves quite a bit. And she served for me the purpose of developing my protagonist. You could find out what punched her buttons and how she dealt with those kinds of irritations, the kind of person she was with that. So it was a good way of defining my protagonist, is by having this secondary, even, once removed more than that, in the story to show, so I wouldn't have to tell what my character was like. You could see her responding.
So that's a very common tool, is to use what's called a foil, or another character, kind of almost the opposite kind of a character. And they're not always antagonistic. Sometimes they're the fateful companions that travel together. It's just one has a certain group of characteristics, the other has another, so that you can see the interplay to develop both of them. That's a character that's earning its place. A foil is a character that earns their place and can also still be a good character for another series, another book, as you pointed out. If you have 2 or 3 foils for your character, you might have to make the hard choice and say, which one do I keep and which one do I let go? Just kind of look at him Donald Trump style. You're fired. And then win the presidency. I don't know. But whatever the case may be, again, that's redundancy, inherent redundancy in your text. Those are darlings that do need to be cut. Even if you like both foils, you really only need the one. Now, my point in asking, I was going to get to this, in terms of publishing rights, and I just genuinely don't know how this works. Were both the books where you had the returning characters, were those done by the same publisher, A, and B? If not, are there any legal issues to consider if you want to do that?
No, they weren't. Well, I guess it would depend which one we're talking about, but I have one that was not the case. It was done by a different publisher. But my understanding is this, and Tom Clancy went through this, because he had his main character from, well, really his first few books, Red Storm Rising and The Hunt for Red October. And he had his main character, and then when he moved on to something else, he wanted to take the character with him, and they sued him over that. And he ended up winning, because they're not copywriting your character, they're copywriting a story in which the character appears. So I didn't have any problem with it. Now, I imagine there's somebody who can, argue the other way on it. There always is, but yeah, no, the copyright is always in your name anyway. They're your characters, they're your story. What you do is you give the publisher the right to publish it.
Okay, that makes sense. So what are the most common types of darlings that need to be killed? We already mentioned some things, the inherent redundancy. Characters that serve the same purpose is another one. The overdevelopment of a particular characteristic or trait. And adding to that list, I'd also add the, as we said earlier, passages of flowery or unnecessary description, where you're just slowing things down too much. I'd also add to that list long monologues and dialogues that don't necessarily contribute. Or, can I even say, would never happen in real life. The villain monologue. James Bond, I finally have you trapped. All I have to do is pull the trigger and you'll finally be dead. Why are you doing this? Well, let me tell you my whole evil scheme before I actually pull the trigger. No, the bad guy, he pulls the trigger. I guess that's kind of sexist of me to assume that the bad guy is a guy, but the antagonist is going to simply pull the trigger there. Those types of things, really, no matter how brilliant and wonderful they are, if it's not furthering the story, you gotta get rid of it. I think sometimes we'll see long monologues that need to be trimmed up, some that just simply don't have to be there. I think of Henry V's speech in Shakespeare. I'd hate to see any of that go. And I think that's a good balance of getting the point across, being descriptive enough and powerful enough to do the job, but also not belaboring any particular points. And so you'll want to ask yourself, is this monologue and is this dialogue really moving the story forward? I think, and you can agree or disagree with me here, Pops, that dialogue is the most common form of darlings. I think people really fall in love with the dialogues that they write and they want to keep it. And most people would say that the dialogue is not that interesting to them. Dialogue is very tricky to do well. What's your take on dialogue?
Yeah, dialogue is extremely important. It is an action scene. It may not be physical action, but the discussion reveals a great deal about the characters and the situation. And especially if you have a team, the way they interact with each other will tell you a lot about those team members. So when I was doing the military special ops ones, the way they interacted, and I would have the jokes they told and the way they teased each other and stuff like that, not to fill up pages, but for us to see how men like that relate to one another. Did that with the Perry Sachs novels. He has a team, and not a military team, but nonetheless, they know each other very well. They would die for each other, but you get this sense of camaraderie where you're only going to get that dialogue. You don't want to write some kind of prose that says, and they really liked each other. You have to show that. So dialogue needs to do the same, follow the same guidelines as before, that it needs to define the character, further the story, and so on, as we would think of any action scene. So yeah, extremely important.
You can always tell bad dialogue. Bad dialogue is going to ruin your story. But generally, if you can, on your second read through, you're going to find that it's not good, and that's not a darling. You just need to cut it. But it's when you read the dialogue and you're like, oh, that's so good. That one-liner is perfect. I love it. But it's not doing what I needed to do right here.
And editors will tell you. I worked with a very strict editor one time, and he wanted me to cut some dialogue out, and I was resistant because I really worked hard on it. I liked it, but he was very kind and forced me to take it out anyway. And he was right; it did not belong. And looking back, I'm embarrassed that I put it in there in the first place. I just thought it was witty and revealing, and that I was just a great writer for having put that in there. And turns out it was all the opposite of that. So sometimes when people tell you, yeah, you really don't need this, yeah, don't get up in arms, especially if they know what they're talking about, like a good editor. You have to, take that, review it, and most likely the editor's right. But don't tell any editor I ever said that, okay? So
I think that's the easiest way to identify darlings is when your editor says it needs to go and you go, but I like it. That's a darling. But no.
I worked with a guy, he wanted to be Faulkner, and he would mimic the style, which did not fit what he was writing, and I kept correcting it. I was supposed to fix it up, and I kept fixing it up, and he'd change it back. And finally I said, well, I'm not going to keep doing this. but I want to sound like Faulkner. Faulkner's dead.
He doesn't sound like anything
He
right
doesn't-
now.
Yeah, and what he wrote then wouldn't fly today, and he wouldn't write that way today. Because he knew what he was doing in the 20s. He was a professional, so I don't think he'd write that way today.
It's very easy for me to laugh at that man. Haha, there. The sad truth is I'm also guilty of doing things like that, either trying too hard to sound like a particular author. But I started off as an English teacher, so I felt like I needed to run with this idea of symbolism and heavy thematic ideas and ruminations on the nature of life, and just entire pages and screaming, just, aren't I a genius? Revere me, which is really kind of pathetic now that I say it out loud. But when you're writing for the adulation of your readers, I think that's problematic. You're going to have a lot of darlings there. The goal is not to be revered by your readers. The goal is to tell them a good story. The goal is to make them forget that they're even reading, and to instead experience things. Yes. And that's going to be tough to do. And so you have to get out of your own way. Another one of the darlings is these authorial intrusions on the nature of life, etc., which you'll see, I think, with a lot of beginning writers who say, I want to write a book about, and then insert theme, the evils of drunk driving. Well, if you want to write about that, just write an essay. You don't need to write a novel. You know what I'm saying? Just write an essay. Instead, if you want to tell a story that might reveal an aspect of life or nature that people might not be intimately familiar with, okay, if you're going to show it and let the reader experience it. But the best thing to do is to get out of the way of the story and let the story tell itself. Whenever the author becomes noticeable to the reader, either by trying to be too genius or by writing bad dialogue, whatever the case is, whenever the reader says, oh yeah, I'm reading a book, they're going to stop, and that's going to be bad. Unless you're Kurt Vonnegut Jr., and then you make a name for yourself by using authorial intrusions and doing it very well. But he's the only guy that I know of who can do authorial intrusions and still get away with it. And he was actually mentioned by Dave in the chat room tonight, talking about Kilgore Trout, who's a character that appears in many Vonnegut novels. I don't know if he's in all of them, but he's pretty close to being in all of them. And I believe he's actually the protagonist of one or two of them. Then again, Kurt Vonnegut is also a character in Kurt Vonnegut novels. So, talk about authorial intrusions.
Clive Cussler did that. He would write himself into his own book. He'd have some little pivotal role, but it would nonetheless be very important and short.
Absolutely. Yeah. And, sometimes you can get away with it, but when you're doing it too much, it just gets to be, it's not to readers' tastes these days, shall we say, not to a modern reader's taste or a postmodern contemporary reader's tastes. So there's that. Pops, anything else to add on killing your darlings?
No, I think the last thing I would say is the best writers know how to get out of the way of the story. And remember, the story and the reader are the two things that matter.
Absolutely. And anytime that you want to insert yourself in there, that's usually a darling, and it usually needs to go. So next week is our final week of December, our final week of the year. We will be talking about habits of highly successful writers. So we hope you can join us for that. And we do thank you for tuning in and listening. I think we got all the questions in the chat room. So until next week, thank you all so much for listening, and good writing.